The motion to permanently close the human capability file had been on the docket for 6 sessions before anyone in the assembly bothered to schedule a vote. I know because I was the one who kept rescheduling it. My name is Petra Solano. For 11 years I served as a records clerk in the Sovereign Assembly of Recognized Worlds, specifically in the Index Division, the quiet bureaucratic organ responsible for maintaining the capability files of every species, world, and political body recognized under the Karen Accords. We logged fleet inventories. We tracked population figures. We verified resource extraction reports and cross-referenced them against declared colonial holdings. We flagged discrepancies, reconciled conflicting data, and maintained the archive that every treaty negotiation in the Assembly ultimately rested on. It was precise, unglamorous work, and most of the Assembly's senior delegates considered it clerical in the truest possible sense, beneath policy, beneath politics, beneath notice. The people who noticed the index were the people who needed something from it. The people who didn't notice it were the people who had decided, long ago, that its contents would always confirm what they already believed. I was there the morning the human file became the most important document in the Chamber's 300-year history. I was sitting at the index table, 4 meters from the speaker's platform, logging the procedural notes from the prior item on the docket. I had my slate open. I had a cup of cold tea I hadn't touched in 40 minutes. I had, on the left side of my workspace, a printed copy of the motion I had read 9 times in the past 2 weeks, not because my duties required me to read it 9 times, but because the first time I read it I noticed something, and the second time confirmed what I'd noticed, and the 7 subsequent readings were me trying to find a reason the thing I'd noticed wasn't what I thought it was. I never found the reason. The thing I noticed was exactly what I thought it was, but I get ahead of myself. What I want to tell you, what I've tried to tell people who weren't in that room, is that nobody in the assembly that day understood what was about to happen. Not the delegates, not the senior archivists, not the Secretary General's office, which had already drafted congratulatory language for the motion's passage and forwarded it to the Public Affairs Division for formatting. Certainly not Undersecretary Vethanaris of the Thalori delegation, who had sponsored the closure motion in the first place, and who sat that morning in the front tier of the chamber with the particular loose confidence of a man who has already won and is only waiting for the room to catch up. They had every reason to feel confident. The motion was a formality. Everyone in the assembly knew it. The human file had carried the designation unverified, capability index pending review for 31 years. 31 years since the original assessment team had submitted their preliminary report and recommended a full audit. 31 years during which no full audit had ever been commissioned. The preliminary report had never been confirmed or retracted, and the human delegation had existed in a kind of administrative limbo. Present at sessions, permitted to observe, permitted to speak during open comment periods, but barred from treaty access, barred from voting, barred from seated recognition under Article 4 of the Karen Accords until their capability index was certified and logged. 31 years of pending. The closure motion argued, cleanly and without apparent malice, that a file pending for 31 years without substantive update was a file that would never be substantively updated, and that the Assembly's index could not carry an open designation indefinitely. The human entry would be formally closed as capability status, unverifiable at time of review. Earth would remain an observer state. The treaty access question would be deferred to a future session, which was the Assembly's elegant way of saying it would never come up again. The motion had 12 supporting delegations already committed in writing. It had the tacit endorsement of the Secretary General's procedural office. It had the momentum of something everyone in the building had quietly agreed was overdue. Undersecretary Vethanaris had written it himself. He had the votes. He had the procedure. He had 31 years of institutional inertia behind him, compressed and pointed at a single calendar slot on a clear session morning. I had read the motion 9 times. I had also, in the course of my normal archival duties, read the original preliminary report from 31 years ago, the one that had recommended the full audit that never happened. I had read it because my job was to track the status of every open file in the index, and the human file was the oldest open file in the system by a margin of 22 years. Every quarter, I pulled the status queue, and every quarter the human file sat at the top of it. Every quarter I filed a status query to the senior archivist's office, as my procedural obligations required. Every quarter I received back a form letter explaining that the file's open status was under administrative review. The form letter was the same letter each time. At some point I began to understand that administrative review was the division's way of saying that the question had been settled, but the settling hadn't been formally recorded, and that the settled answer was, leave it alone. I want to be careful here about what I knew and when I knew it, because the question was asked of me afterward formally by 3 separate review panels, and my answer was the same each time. I read the preliminary report as a matter of routine. I noted the recommendation it contained. I noted that the recommendation had not been acted upon. I noted, in my 4th year of submitting quarterly status queries that produced the same form letter, that the preliminary report's specific recommendation, full audit within 18 months of filing, had been unacted upon for well over a decade, and that the assessment office's own procedures, which I had read in their entirety, did not contain any provision for indefinitely deferring a filed recommendation. I noted this and I logged it and I filed it and I continued doing my job, because I was a junior clerk and there are limits to what a junior clerk can productively pursue, and because I had no power to compel anything. What I did not do, what I want to be very clear that I did not do, was alert anyone in the human delegation. I didn't need to, they already knew. I understood this later. At the time, I understood only that the file was old and the recommendation was clear and nothing had been done about it, and the motion to close the file permanently was on the docket, and that on the morning of the vote, I sat at the index table with my cold tea and my slate and my printed copy of the motion, and waited to record the outcome. The Sovereign Assembly Chamber is built in the shape of a wide, shallow bowl. 7 tiers of curved seating rise from the floor in a near-complete ring, and the floor itself, the Speaker's platform, the index table, the Secretary General's podium, sits at the bottom of that bowl like a stone dropped into still water, every ripple of seating radiating outward and upward from it. The ceiling is vaulted, supported by columns of pale gray stone that the Assembly's architects had shipped from the Karen homeworld 3 centuries ago as a gesture of founding solemnity. Between the columns, long panels of treated crystal faced outward toward the city, and on a clear session morning light fell through them in broad, flat columns that crossed the tiers and the floor in a slow diagonal march as the day turned. By late morning, they would have moved halfway across the 2nd tier, and by mid-session, they reached the floor and cut bright diagonal lines across the marble between the Speaker's platform and the index table. It was a room built to make the person on the floor feel the weight of 3 centuries of deliberation pressing down on them from the tiers above. I had worked in it for 11 years, and it still worked on me. I arrived early, as I always did. The chamber fills from the top down, the lower tiers, nearest the floor and nearest the authority of the session, are occupied last by the delegates themselves, who arrive with the particular unhurried authority of people who understand that nothing begins without them. The observers and clerks and press credentialists fill in around the edges first, and for the first 40 minutes of any session day, the chamber has the quiet and slightly dusty atmosphere of a library in the early morning, before anyone has decided to be important yet. I set out my materials at the index table and reviewed the session queue. The closure motion was 3rd on the docket. Before it, a fisheries rights dispute between two outer rim species, and a records correction I had handled personally the previous week. I estimated the fisheries matter at 35 to 45 minutes. The records correction would take 4, possibly 5. After those two items, the docket was clear of anything complicated until a major transit agreement in the afternoon session. The motion to close the human file was supposed to take 20 minutes. The human delegation sat in their observers section, which occupied a half bench on the second tier, set off from the voting delegations by a low polished rail and a small identification placard. The placard read Earth Observer State in the Assembly's standard typeface, the same as it had read for 31 years. There were 4 of them that morning. Dr. Amara Osai, the senior envoy, occupied the left seat. She was a compact woman in her late 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who has been very patient for a very long time and has made a private decision about how that patience ends. To her right sat her aide, Tomas, who handled her documents and kept her schedule. The other 2 were specialists I had seen at prior sessions but whose names I hadn't learned. A tall man with a narrow face who always had a secondary data slate open, and a younger woman who took meticulous handwritten notes on paper, which was unusual enough that I had noticed it across several sessions. I noticed the human delegation when I came in, because I always noticed them. Not out of any particular solidarity, I want to be honest about that, but because they were always the stillest people in the room. Every other observer section had some ambient motion to it, delegates conferring in low voices, aides passing notes, someone checking a data slate or adjusting their position, or exchanging the small social signals of people who expect to be in the room for a long time and are managing their energy accordingly. The human section sat like furniture. Dr. Os, in particular, gave the impression not of waiting, but of having already arrived at wherever she needed to be, and of finding the room around her to be slightly beside the point. I had watched her across many sessions. She never spoke during open comment periods, which was her right under observer protocol but which was unusual. Most long-term observer states use the comment period to keep themselves visible, to remind the assembly that they were present and interested and still engaged. Earth didn't do that. Earth sat in their half-bench section and observed, which was what observers were technically supposed to do, and which almost no one actually did. The chamber filled. Undersecretary Vethanaris arrived with his staff at the 20-minute mark, when the fisheries matter was already wrapping its preliminary argument phase. He was tall most thaloriar, with the elongated skull and wide-set amber eyes common to his species, and the particular way they have of moving through a room that suggests the room was arranged with them specifically in mind. He wore the deep indigo ceremonial vest of a senior delegate, and he greeted 3 colleagues on his way to his seat, unhurried, nodding at their murmured words with the easy authority of a man who has been a senior delegate for 15 years and intends to be one for 15 more. He did not look at the human observer section. I do not think it occurred to him to look. The fisheries matter concluded. The records correction took 5 minutes because the relevant treaty contained a disputed hyphenation in the original Karen text, and the Deputy Secretary General and the floor archivist, me, disagreed briefly about how to render it in the corrected index entry. We resolved it. The Deputy Secretary General accepted the correction with the good grace of a man who had not particularly cared either way. The Secretary General called the 3rd item. He read the motion aloud, as procedure required. 6 minutes. The language was precise and temperate and gave nothing away. It was the kind of text that accomplishes something significant while sounding entirely routine, the bureaucratic equivalent of a door closing quietly on a room where something has died. I followed along on my printed copy. I had underlined in the margin of the 8th reading the phrase capability status, unverifiable at time of review. It was the phrase that bothered me most, not because it was inaccurate in any way the assembly could be held to account for, but because it was specifically constructed to be unaccountable, unverifiable, not false, not absent, not suppressed, unverifiable. A word that put the responsibility for the gap in the index not on the people who had declined to look, but on the data itself. The Secretary General asked if the sponsoring delegation wished to speak. Undersecretary Vethanaris rose. He was, by any measure, a skilled speaker, measured, credentialed, someone who understood that the appearance of reluctance is always more persuasive than enthusiasm. He spoke for 9 minutes. He expressed, with the practiced gravity of someone who has rehearsed regret until it resembles sincerity, that the Assembly's indexing integrity required resolution of long-standing open designations. He noted that 31 years was beyond any reasonable interpretation of pending review. He observed that the closure motion did not prejudice Earth's future applications. The observer status would remain. The door was not closed. The Assembly's commitment to inclusivity was unchanged. He noted that the preliminary report of 31 years ago had contained a recommendation, but that the Assessment Office had, over the intervening decades, determined that the data available at the time of the preliminary filing was insufficient to support a full audit under current verification standards. He cited 2 procedural precedents in which open files from other observer states had been similarly closed after extended review periods. He sat down. I had been writing his words as he spoke, which was my function. My handwriting, which is ordinarily clear and even, became smaller and tighter in the final minutes of his remarks. The Secretary General asked if any delegation wished to speak in opposition. I looked at the human section. Dr. Osa had not moved. She sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her, looking at the floor of the chamber below, the same marble floor, the same diagonal line of morning light crossing it, that I was sitting 4 meters behind. Her eyes were not unfocused. She was not staring into the middle distance the way people do when they are trying not to react. She was looking at the floor with the specific attention of someone who has found it to be the most interesting thing in the room, and who has no particular reason to pretend otherwise. Tomas had his data slate face down on the table. The Secretary General waited 30 seconds. No opposition registered. He announced the call to vote and reached for the vote control panel. That was when every delegate terminal in the chamber chimed simultaneously. I have tried in the years since to describe accurately what a room full of senior diplomats looks like when 47 terminals receive the same unexpected transmission at precisely the same moment. The honest answer is that it looks like nothing at first, a fraction of a second where the fact of the sound precedes the meaning of it, where 47 simultaneous notification tones are simply a coincidence of timing that the brain has not yet assigned a category to. Then the motion in the room stops, not all at once and not dramatically. The Secretary General's hand, which had been moving toward the vote panel, slows and does not reach it. The Undersecretary's head turns toward his terminal. The Grethani delegate, who had been consulting a paper document, puts it down. An aide in the 3rd tier touches her ear, which is where she keeps her audio interface, with the precise motion of someone who has just heard something and is verifying that she heard it correctly. Then everyone looks at their screens. The document that had arrived in every delegate queue, every recognized delegate queue, every observer queue, every press credential queue, the Secretary General's queue, the Assessment Office's queue, the Floor Archivist's queue, which was mine, the Security Office queue, and as I learned later, the Karen Historical Archives Public Distribution queue, was titled Earth Capability Index Complete Assessment Report, YEARS 1 through 31 of pending designation. It was 412 pages. I know the page count because I read every one of them. Not immediately. In the first 90 seconds I read only the first page, which was enough to tell me what the document was and what it was going to do to the morning. But I read all 412 pages, and I will tell you what was in them, because what was in them is the point. The document was the capability assessment that had never been commissioned. Except it had been commissioned. It had been commissioned and conducted and compiled and completed, not by the Assembly's Assessment Office, which had declined to act on the preliminary report's recommendation, but by the human delegation itself, which had been conducting its own capability census every 3 years for the past 31 years, and logging the results in a format that precisely matched the Assembly's own index specifications. Not approximately matched, precisely matched. Field by field, category by category, using the Assembly's own terminology and organizational structure and unit definitions. Updated each time, the Assembly revised its verification standards to reflect the new standards, without being asked, without acknowledgement, without any indication from the Assembly that anyone was paying attention. 31 years of data, fleet inventories, colonial holdings, population figures, resource extraction rates, treaty compliance records from every bilateral agreement Earth had entered into during the observer period, technological development indices, infrastructure assessments, medical capability ratings, educational and research output, diplomatic contact records covering 31 years of meetings, negotiations, and agreements with non-assembly species that the Assembly had no record of whatsoever. All of it formatted to Assembly standard, all of it sourced and cited with primary source documentation attached, all of it current as of 48 hours prior to the session. And at the front of it, page 1, before the table of contents, before the executive summary, a single paragraph. It read, "The Sovereign Assembly's Index Division has maintained an open designation on the Earth Capability File for 31 years on the basis that no certified assessment has been submitted. The following document constitutes that assessment, self-certified under Article 17 of the Karen Accords, which permits observer states to submit capability data directly to the full Assembly when the Index Division has failed to commission an assessment within 15 years of a pending designation. We note that this provision has never previously been invoked. We note also that the preliminary report from 31 years prior, which recommended a full audit, remains in the Assembly's own archive. We have attached it as Appendix A." That was all it said. Dr. Osai's hands were still folded on the table. She had not looked at her terminal. The next 4 minutes were the quietest I had ever heard that chamber. There is a specific quality to silence in a large institutional space, not the absence of sound, because there is never true silence in a room with 47 delegations and their staffs and the ambient hum of climate systems and translation infrastructure. It is the absence of deliberate sound. The sounds that remain are involuntary, the soft mechanical breath of the ventilation, the subtle electrical hum of the holographic systems along the chamber walls, the small sounds of people shifting in their seats or setting down a data slate or drawing a slow, careful breath. The sounds of people who have, temporarily, forgotten that they were about to say something. I watched Undersecretary Vethonaris. I want to record this accurately because I understand there is a temptation, in retrospect, to describe the powerful man's discomfort in satisfying terms, and I am trying to be a reliable witness rather than a satisfying storyteller. He did not panic. He was not a man who panicked visibly, and I doubt that 31 years of institutional authority had left him with much practice at it. What he did was read. He read the first page of the document with the controlled, methodical attention of a man who has just felt the ground change under him and is trying to determine the new position of his feet before he takes his next step. Then he turned to the executive summary on page 2. I could not read his expression from the index table. The distance was too great and the angle was wrong. But I could see the specific quality of stillness that came over him, the kind of stillness that is not composure but a very good approximation of it, the kind that holds as long as the face believes it is being observed. His aide leaned in and said something low. The undersecretary did not respond for several seconds. Then he touched his aide's arm once briefly, and the aide straightened and was quiet. The Grethani delegate had passed her data slate to her senior aide, which was a thing she did when she needed both hands free to think. Her senior aide was reading, and the Grethani delegate was looking at the space in front of her with the expression of someone running a rapid internal calculation. On the second tier in the observer section, Tomas had not moved. Dr. Osa had not moved. Her hands were in the same position they had been in when the Secretary General had been about to call the vote. The Secretary General looked up from his terminal. He looked at the chamber, the full sweep of it, the way a presiding officer looks when he is deciding what kind of moment he is managing. Then he said, quietly, "The Assembly will take a brief recess." No ceremony, no procedural language, just the sentence, delivered in the tone of a man who has been a Secretary General long enough to understand when the agenda needs reconsidering, and who does not intend to make a performance of the reconsidering. The chamber rose and began to move, and in the human observer section, 2 tiers up from the floor, Dr. Amara Osai unfolded her hands, placed them flat on the table, and stood without visible hurry. The recess lasted 40 minutes. I remained at the index table as my post required. I used the time to read. By the time the chamber reconvened, I had read 130 pages of the document. I will not claim I read them with professional detachment. I read them the way you read something you have suspected exists for a long time and have been told, repeatedly and by people with authority, does not. The fleet inventory covered 63 pages. It was organized by class, by system, by operational designation, and by year of commissioning, and it was annotated with citations to navigational transit records, construction facility output reports, and crew certification logs that I recognized as real documents because they matched formats I had seen in other states' certification files. The fleet it described was not a defensive perimeter fleet. It was not the kind of force a mid-tier observer world maintains to discourage opportunistic aggression. It was built for something with wider reach and longer ambition than that, and the 31 years of the index made it possible to watch it being built. Year by year, class by class, the curve of it rising from modest to substantial to something that did not fit cleanly into any category, the Assembly's threat assessment framework had prepared language for. The colonial holdings section was 41 pages, 47 established settlements across 11 systems, 62 million permanent residents, conservatively calculated. Each settlement listed by name, coordinates, founding date, population, primary economic output, infrastructure classification, and self-reported defensive capacity. Every settlement established in strict compliance with the Karen Accord's baseline protocols for observer state navigation and habitation. Not approximately compliant, precisely compliant. The kind of compliance that suggests someone had read the Accords very carefully and understood exactly what the Accords permitted and intended to operate entirely within it. None of the 47 settlements had applied for Assembly recognition. They had no reason to. Observer state settlements are not entitled to Assembly protection regardless of whether they are registered. The registration would have given the Assembly a record of their existence. The human delegation had apparently weighed those two facts and found the record more costly than the protection. The diplomatic contact section was something different. 63 pages of bilateral engagements with species and political bodies that the Assembly had no files on, not because they were newly discovered, but because they were parties the Assembly had classified as too peripheral for priority engagement. Small populations, remote locations, limited resource bases. The kind of species that gets an observer queue entry and never rises above it, because no one with votes has a reason to prioritize their case. Earth had been meeting with them. Not all of them, not all 63 pages worth, but systematically over years, with the kind of patient consistency that produces genuine relationships rather than courtesy contacts. The document listed agreements, mutual aid frameworks, navigation sharing compacts, medical exchange protocols, small things individually, the kind of small things that add up. I finished the section, put my slate down for a moment, and looked at the chamber around me. The recess was still ongoing. The light had moved. The diagonal line of morning light that had been crossing the marble floor an hour ago had reached the base of the speaker's platform and was beginning its slow climb. I picked my slate back up and kept reading. When the session reconvened, Undersecretary Vethonaris did not rise. The delegate who took the floor was a mid-tier representative from Ondavar named Councillor Prethaman, who I knew from 11 years of index work as a careful and thorough administrator. She was not a political actor in the Assembly's usual sense. She did not seek the floor in sessions she didn't need to speak in, and she didn't speak in sessions she couldn't speak accurately in. And over 11 years, both of those things had produced a reputation that was quiet enough to be overlooked and solid enough to matter when it became relevant. Her rising, rather than the undersecretary's, told me something about how the recess had gone. She said, without preamble, "The Ondavar delegation formally requests that the motion to close the Earth capability file be withdrawn from consideration pending review of the submitted documentation." Undersecretary Vethonaris did not respond from his seat. His aide spoke. "The Thalori delegation concurs with the request for withdrawal pending review." 11 words, 40 minutes of recess to arrive at them. The Secretary General noted the withdrawal for the record. He then announced, in the same measured register he had used for the recess call, that the Assembly's Index Division would undertake a full review of the submitted document against Assembly verification standards, and that the Human Files Open designation would remain pending that review. He did not provide a timeline. He did not indicate how the review would be structured or who would conduct it. He said what was procedurally necessary and stopped. He looked at the Human Observer section. Dr. Ose inclined her head. Not a bow, not an acknowledgement of victory, not even the kind of nod that signals comprehension. A motion of the head that a person makes when something has been said that needed to be said and has been heard, and the hearing is sufficient. The Secretary General called the next item on the docket. I put my stylus to my slate and recorded the withdrawal. My handwriting by that point was very even. The review took 9 months. I was assigned to the team, not as a lead, but as one of 7 index clerks responsible for cross-referencing submitted data against Assembly archives and external records. It was the most intensive work I had done in 11 years of division service, and I will not pretend that it was without its complications. The document was accurate. Every figure we could independently verify, we verified, and not one significant discrepancy emerged between what Earth had submitted and what the available records supported. The colonial settlement data matched navigational transit logs that the Assembly's own monitoring infrastructure had accumulated over the past 3 decades. The fleet inventory matched transponder registrations from systems where Assembly sensor networks had recorded traffic. The bilateral diplomatic contact records matched counterpart filings from several of the non-Assembly species involved, which the review team obtained through the relevant observer state channels. I want to dwell for a moment on the monitoring infrastructure, because I think it is important, and because I am not sure the review panel's published finding conveyed it with sufficient clarity. The Assembly's sensor network in the outer approach corridors is not young technology. It was established 40 years ago and updated on a rolling cycle that, in practice, means approximately half of it is outdated at any given time. It records traffic. It logs transit events. It files them by corridor designation, by approximate vessel class, and by timestamp. What it does not do, what no one had set it up to do, is generate alerts for traffic in corridors classified as low significance. The outer approaches to the SOL system include 4 transit corridors. 2 of them are primary corridors, listed in the Assembly's navigational registry as high significance because they connect to established trade routes. The other 2 are secondary corridors, listed as low significance because they connect primarily to uninhabited or sparsely populated regions and have historically carried little commercial traffic. The human fleet, it turned out, had been using the secondary corridors. The sensor network had dutifully logged every transit event. The logs were in the archive. Nobody had looked at them in a long time because they were in the low significance corridors, and there was no automated alert system for low significance corridor traffic, and nobody had thought to look at low significance corridor traffic manually because the whole point of classifying something as low significance is to allow yourself to not look at it. The review team spent 3 weeks pulling and analyzing the corridor logs. I was responsible for cross-referencing them against the fleet inventory Earth had submitted. The correlation was high. Not perfect. There were transit events the inventory didn't account for, and a small number of inventory entries that didn't have corresponding corridor logs, both of which were consistent with normal operational variation. But the correlation was high enough that by the end of the 3rd week, everyone on the review team understood what we were looking at. We were looking at 31 years of a fleet moving through corridors that the Assembly had decided were not worth watching, to and from settlements that the Assembly had no record of, in configurations that the Assembly's threat assessment frameworks had not been asked to evaluate because no one had submitted a capability file. Everything had been visible, nothing had been looked at. I brought this formulation to the lead reviewer, Valdris, in month 4. She was a senior archivist, 15 years my senior, precise and experienced, and with the particular authority of someone who has spent decades turning complicated situations into clear record. She read my memo, she set it down. "Log it," she said. "I have," I said. "I'm asking what we write about it." "We write what the review requires. We verify the data. We confirm or deny the capability index. We submit the finding." And the monitoring gap, the corridor logs, the 31 years of traffic that went unreviewed. She looked at me for a long moment. She was not dismissing the question. I want to be accurate about this. She was considering it carefully, the way she considered everything, and I think what she was weighing was the difference between what the review was constituted to do and what the review might be asked to do if the answer to my question was included in the finding. "Those questions," she said, "belong to a separate process." I asked her what process. She didn't answer. I logged it and moved on. I had learned over 11 years the difference between the questions a junior clerk can pursue and the questions a junior clerk can only record. The review finding was submitted in month 9. I was not in the chamber for the session at which it was presented. Valdris led the presentation, as was appropriate, and I read the transcript the same evening from the index office. The finding confirmed the Human Capability Index in full. All 412 pages, assessed against Assembly verification standards, confirmed at a 94% verification confidence. The threshold for certification was 80%. The remaining 6% was flagged for continued monitoring, which is the standard notation for data that cannot be independently confirmed to primary source level, but which does not rise to the level of contradiction. The fleet inventory was confirmed. The colonial holdings were confirmed. The diplomatic contact records were confirmed. The population data, the resource assessments, the infrastructure ratings, the bilateral agreements confirmed. The index was certified. Under Article 4 of the Karen Accords, A certified capability index entitles the submitting state to ceded recognition, full treaty access, and voting participation in the assembly. Earth had been an observer state for 31 years. The session at which the finding was presented was attended by the full human delegation, which I learned numbered 12 people, though most of them had been kept in a support office outside the chamber during the review period. Dr. Ose sat in the observer section in her usual seat for the last time. When the Secretary General read the finding and announced the certification and called for the seating motion, she did not speak. She did not smile, at least not in any way the session recording captures with certainty. I have watched the recording several times, and there is a moment, just after the Secretary General calls the motion, where the angle of her face shifts slightly in a way that might be many things. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at the floor. The seating motion passed. Every delegation voted in favor, including the Thalori delegation, whose senior delegate had by that point been replaced by a junior colleague whose name I do not recall. I don't know what it cost the undersecretary to have that vote cast in his delegation's name. I will admit I thought about it for a while, and then I stopped thinking about it, because the record was what the record was, and thinking about his costs wasn't going to change it. In the months following the certification, the question of what had happened to the preliminary report's audit recommendation attracted a great deal of institutional attention. Review panels were commissioned, testimony was taken. I provided testimony twice, once in writing, once in a formal oral session that lasted 2.5 hours before a panel of 3 retired assembly judges. I will tell you what I told them, because I believe it is the honest accounting, and because honest accountings are in short supply in matters of this kind. The preliminary report was filed 31 years ago by an assessment team that had done its work correctly. Their recommendation was not ambiguous. At the time of filing, the assessment office was managing a large review backlog, and the human observer application was new, and Earth was a minor observer state with a modest preliminary file. The human file went to the bottom of the queue. At some point in the following year, the internal communications from that period are incompletely archived, which is itself a fact the panel noted. Someone made a prioritization decision that left the human file at the bottom of the queue for the next 3 decades. Whether that decision was made with knowledge of what a full audit might find, I cannot say with certainty. What I can say is that the same year the preliminary report was filed, the Thalori delegation submitted an unusual number of procedural motions regarding observer state criteria. I can say that the preliminary report's own language, which I read carefully, noted that the early data on human industrial and colonial development was proceeding at a rate that, in the assessment team's exact words, warrants expedited review. The panel's finding, issued 6 months after my testimony, described the failure to commission the audit as an administrative oversight resulting from prioritization decisions made during a high-volume review period. It recommended procedural reforms. Several reforms were implemented. The question of intent was not resolved. The evidence, the panel noted, did not rise to the standard required for a finding of deliberate suppression. Dr. Ose was asked about the finding at a press session shortly after its release. She said 4 words, "The record speaks clearly." She was not asked a follow-up question, and she did not offer one. I read the panel's finding twice. I read Dr. Ose's 4 words once, and I have not needed to read them again. There is something I have thought about many times in the years since the certification, and I want to try to say it clearly, because I think it is the center of what happened in that chamber, and what the chamber has never fully reckoned with. The Karen Accords are a document built on the assumption that the index is complete. Every treaty negotiation, every vote on resource access or transit rights or military cooperation, every decision the Assembly makes about who has what and who can do what and who needs protection from whom, All of it rests on the premise that the capability files are accurate and current, and reflect the actual state of every party involved. The index is not a supporting document. It is the foundation. Everything the assembly does is downstream of it. The human file was blank for 31 years. Not blank because Earth had nothing. Blank because the assembly stopped looking. And because the assembly stopped looking, every decision it made about the outer approaches and the secondary transit corridors and the resource partition agreements that affected the 11 systems where Earth had established settlements was made without accurate information about a relevant party. The assembly voted. The assembly negotiated. The assembly divided things up and assigned rights and established precedents for 31 years, with a blank where the human data was supposed to be. The human delegation watched it happen. They attended sessions and they sat in their half-bench section, and they did not speak during comment periods, and they folded their hands on the table, and they watched the assembly govern a region it did not have accurate data on, and they built, and they documented, and they waited. I have been asked whether I think what they did constitutes a kind of deception, whether the decision not to volunteer their capability data before the closure motion constituted, at minimum, a deliberate choice to let the assembly remain uninformed. I have thought about this question carefully because it deserves a careful answer. Article 17 of the Karen Accords exists because the founders of the assembly understood that the assessment office might fail to commission a required audit. They built a remedy. An observer state may submit its own capability data to the full assembly when the index division has failed to act within 15 years of a pending designation. The provision is in the Accords. It has been in the Accords since the founding session. It was not invoked for 31 years because no observer state had ever been in a position to invoke it, or had wanted to, or had prepared to, or had been patient enough to wait for precisely the moment when its invocation would matter most. The human delegation did not deceive anyone. They did what the Accords permitted. They used the time the assembly had given them, the 31 years of observer status that was supposed to be administrative limbo, to build what they needed and document what they'd built and wait for the procedural moment when the documentation could not be set aside. They waited until the assembly made the mistake of trying to close the file, which triggered Article 17's window, and in the second before the vote could be called they put 412 pages of certified self-assessment into every terminal in the room. They did it by the rules, every word of it. And the thing that I think the assembly found most difficult, in the months of review and testimony and procedural reform that followed, the thing that no finding ever quite said aloud, was that there was nothing to correct for. The Accords had functioned exactly as written. The observer state had exercised a right the Accords explicitly provided. The capability index was accurate and certified and filed. The seating motion had passed. Earth was a member state. The rule was applied. The outcome followed. The blank was filled in. What the blank had concealed was not a failure of the human delegation to comply. It was a failure of the assembly to look. I left the index division 2 years after the certification. Not because of any formal pressure. I want to be clear about that. My record with the division was clean. My work during the review had been commended by Valdris in the closing report, and there was a reasonable path to a senior archivist position if I wanted it. I did not want it. I had spent 11 years maintaining a system I believed, when I started, was the honest accounting of what the assembly needed to know. I still believe the system is capable of being that. I no longer believe it naturally tends toward it. I keep a copy of the preliminary report on my desk, the one from 31 years ago, the one that recommended the audit that was never commissioned. I keep it because it is the clearest document in this entire history, clearer than the 412 pages, clearer than the review finding, clearer than the panel's finding on intent. It is a short document, 12 pages. It says, We want to look at the human data, and what we found suggests the assembly should look more carefully, and we recommend a full audit within 18 months. 12 pages, clear recommendation, filed correctly, attached as Appendix A to the document that ended 31 years of pending. The assessment office received it and put it at the bottom of a queue, and the queue never came back around. And for 3 decades, the most important file in the index was the one nobody had been asked to open. Dr. Osite knew the file was there. She knew the recommendation. She knew that the recommendation had not been acted on, and she knew that Article 17 existed and that it had never been invoked, and that its window opened after 15 years of inaction. I don't know when, exactly. She understood that the assembly was going to try to close the file permanently rather than open it. I suspect she understood it earlier than anyone in the assembly thought to worry about. I suspect she had been prepared for that morning, for longer than I want to calculate. When the undersecretary was giving his 9-minute speech about indexing integrity and the unfortunate necessities of administrative housekeeping, she was looking at the floor. When every terminal in the chamber chimed, she didn't look at hers. When the Secretary General looked at her section after the withdrawal and the announcement of the review, she inclined her head once and was still. She had prepared the document. She had transmitted it at the correct moment. She had invoked the correct provision. She had done what the accords required and nothing more. And then she sat down and she folded her hands, and the 412 pages spoke for themselves. That is the thing I have turned over the most in the years since. Not the fleet, not the colonies, not the diplomatic network or the corridor logs or the procedural provision that no one had remembered to worry about. The thing I have turned over is the simplicity of it. The assembly had a file on every recognized species. The file was the foundation of everything the assembly did. And for 31 years the human file was blank, and the assembly looked at the blank and saw containment, and they were wrong. The blank was not containment. The blank was 31 years of work that nobody had asked about. On the morning they tried to close it permanently, it answered. I want to add one more thing, because I think it belongs in any honest accounting of what those months were like, and what the assembly looked like from the inside of the review. There is a quality that institutions develop when they are very old and very powerful and very certain of their own procedures, and that quality is the assumption that the procedure is sufficient. Not that the procedure produces good outcomes. The assembly's proceduralists were too careful for that kind of simplicity, but that the procedure, properly followed, exhausts the institution's obligation. The index division logs what it is given. The assessment office commissions what it is asked to commission. The senior archivist's office answers status queries with the appropriate form letters. The Secretary General calls the docket in order. Each link in the chain does what the chain requires, and if the chain fails to produce an accurate picture of the world, that is a failure of inputs rather than of procedure. The preliminary report was an input. It had been received and logged, which was what the procedure required of the receiving office. That it had then been placed in a queue that never moved was, within the procedural frame, a resource allocation decision, not a failure. The assessment office had more high-priority work. The human file was low priority. The queue was managed accordingly. The procedure was followed. I spent 9 months on the review team thinking about this, and what I concluded, which I recorded in my personal notes and did not include in any formal filing, is that the procedure is designed to work when everyone inside it is trying to produce an accurate picture. When someone inside it wants to produce a particular picture instead, the procedure accommodates them without knowing it is being accommodated. The form letters go out. The status queries are answered. The file stays open. The designation stays pending. The procedure continues to function as a procedure even when what it is producing is not an accurate index, but the impression of one. The human delegation understood this. They had 31 years to understand it. What I think they grasped, and what I am still, years later, working out the full dimensions of is that an institution that trusts its procedure more than its outcomes can be used against itself. Not through deception, not through any violation of its rules, but simply by working inside those rules more carefully and more patiently than the institution expected anyone to bother. The Karen Accords had a provision for exactly the situation Earth was in. The provision had never been invoked because no observer state had stayed in that situation long enough and built enough to make the invocation decisive. Earth did both of those things. They stayed. They built. They documented what they built to assembly standard for 31 years, and when the window opened, they used it. The assembly looked at that and spent 9 months trying to find something in it that was wrong, and the finding was that nothing was wrong. The procedure had been followed. The provision had been properly invoked. The data was accurate. The certification was warranted. The most powerful deliberative body in the known assembly of worlds had spent 9 months confirming that it had been outworked, within its own rules, by the state it had spent 31 years treating as a pending matter. I will not say that this produced humility in the assembly. I don't think institutions that old produce humility easily, and I think the procedural reform process that followed was, in part, a way of telling a story in which what had happened was a fixable administrative lapse rather than a demonstration of something more fundamental about the gap between procedure and accuracy. The reforms were real. Some of them are good. None of them address the gap. What addresses the gap is actually looking at the files, at the data, at the things the procedure has logged and then set aside as low priority and not returned to. Looking at the corridors that are classified as low significance not because nothing moves through them, but because no one has checked. Looking at the observer section and asking what 31 years of quiet patience in a half-bench seat might actually represent. The assembly had all of that available to it. It did not look. Dr. Osai looked. For 31 years, every 3 years, her delegation produced a certified capability assessment and held it in their own archive, formatted to assembly standard, waiting for the procedural moment when it could be properly received. The preliminary report said 31 years ago that there was something worth looking at. She knew the preliminary report existed. She knew no one was going to look at it. She built the answer to it anyway, and she documented the building, and she waited. I think about that kind of patience. I am not sure I understand it fully. I am not sure it is possible to understand it fully from the outside, without having sat in the observer section for 31 years and watched the docket and read the transcripts and understood, year by year, what the blank in the index was doing for the people who preferred it blank. I understand the patience only as a result. 412 pages, formatted to standard, transmitted to every terminal in the chamber in the second before the vote to close the file could be called. The file was blank because the assembly preferred it blank. The blank was supposed to be the answer to the question of what Earth was. It was not the answer. It was only the absence of one, and an absence, as every indexer knows or ought to know, is not a finding. It is a gap. A gap is not information. A gap is only the shape of what you didn't look at. For 31 years, the assembly looked at the shape of what it hadn't looked at and called it settled. On a clear session morning, with the light coming through the crystal panels in long diagonal columns across the marble floor, the gap was filled. I was 4 meters away. I had cold tea on my left and the motion on my right and my stylus ready for the outcome. The outcome was 412 pages, and a woman who had been waiting for 31 years, and her hands folded on a table, and not one unnecessary word. I have thought about those 4 words many times. The record speaks clearly. I have thought about all the words she chose not to say in 9 minutes of remarks that she was given and did not use. All the things she could have explained, could have argued, could have made plain from the observer section while the undersecretary made his 9 minutes of careful regret sound like a service to the indexing system. She said nothing. She waited. She transmitted the document. She said 4 words when she was asked, and those 4 words were enough. The record does speak clearly. It spoke for 31 years into an empty room, and when the room was finally forced to listen, what it heard was everything. That is what I remember. That is what I would want anyone who asks about that morning to know. Not the fleet, not the colonial holdings, though those matter enormously, and their political consequences are still unfolding in ways that will occupy assembly scholars for a generation. Not the procedural finding or the reform package, or the question of intent that the panel chose not to resolve. What I remember is the silence after the chime. The 47 terminals receiving the same document at the same moment, and the chamber going still around it, and the Secretary General's hand stopping before it reached the vote panel, and the Undersecretary reading the executive summary with the particular stillness of a man finding new ground under his feet. And 4 meters away, in the observer section, Dr. Amara Osei with her hands on the table and her eyes on the floor, and nothing left to wait for. The file was answered, the blank was filled. 31 years of pending arrived at its conclusion, not because the Assembly finally got around to looking, but because the state it had filed as pending had filled in its own file and placed it, correctly and completely and formatted to standard, in every terminal in the room. They had a file for every species. They left ours blank. We kept our own.